Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
Yesterday at dinner, while the plates were still being passed around and everyone was in that restless, half-listening mode, my mother raised her glass and said, "Here's to the child who actually made something of herself." She looked straight at my sister, smiled proudly, and clinked glasses with whoever was closest. I sat there, forcing myself to keep a neutral face, because in that moment I knew saying anything would only feed the performance she had rehearsed for years. Instead, I reached into my bag, pulled out a sealed envelope, slid it across the table toward her, and said calmly, "Curious, because this was addressed to your success yesterday." She gave me a tight laugh, the kind she uses when she thinks I am being dramatic, but when she opened it, her hands trembled and the color drained from her face. "Are you ready for a shocking truth?" Because this wasn't just about an offhand insult, or one of the hundreds of times she brushed me aside. This was about proof, real proof, that the woman who had spent years parading my sister's so-called accomplishments was cashing in on my work behind my back. Inside the envelope was a printed email chain between her and a brand representative named Mara Collins, someone who had been corresponding with my mother as if Jenna, my sister, were the one who had earned my professional award. My name, my photo, my certificate, all were being pitched as part of Jenna's coaching empire, with the money arranged to funnel directly into her account. And the kicker? My mother had actually referred to me in that email as the backup child. Not daughter. Not Nora. Backup child. I had discovered it only because she made a mistake. She copied my work email on the thread by accident, maybe forgetting that Nora H was not the same as Nora H Gmail. At first I thought it was spam, but the subject line had my award name. I clicked it, and within seconds my stomach dropped. She wasn't bragging. She wasn't exaggerating. She was selling me, my career, my nights of unpaid overtime to build my sister's brand. And in her own words, she promised Mara that Jenna could offer exclusive rights to our family's story, as if she owned not just the version she told at dinner parties, but the facts themselves. That night, I barely slept. I called my employer's legal department the next morning and asked if they considered my award and image to be company property. They did, which meant that no one outside of me and my employer had the right to use them for commercial purposes. When I forwarded them the email chain, they did not laugh or dismiss it as family drama. They acted. Within hours, the brand received a formal notice: cease use of Nora Hayes' name, image, or award. Any campaign referencing those must redirect all promotional goodwill to a scholarship fund being established with the college where I got my start. The brand rep, cautious and calculating, didn't fight. She simply replied with one line: "Understood, terms updated." So by the time my mother lifted her glass and toasted Jenna's supposed success, I already knew that the money they had been expecting, money tied to me, to my work, would no longer land in Jenna's account. Instead, the checks were rerouted to a scholarship named after our grandmother, Ruth Hayes, a woman who had once told me quietly in the kitchen, "Don't let them use you to build someone else's throne." I had promised her I would try, though at the time I didn't think I would ever have the strength. Now, years later, the paperwork spoke louder than I ever could. My mother shuffled through the pages, eyes darting, lips pressed so tight they nearly disappeared. Around the table, forks clinked nervously, everyone pretending not to stare. My sister, clueless, leaned over to peek at the letterhead. The second she saw the brand logo, she gasped. I sat there, silent, sipping water, because I wanted the words on the page to do the cutting. Finally, she looked up and whispered, "How did you get into my email?" Her voice wasn't angry, it was scared, because she knew if I had hacked her account she could call it illegal. I smiled just enough to show I was calm, not gloating, and said I didn't. "You CC'd me by mistake." That was the moment the performance cracked. Her hand shook as she folded the papers back into the envelope. My sister hissed, "What did you do?" And I answered with the truth. I just reminded them who earned it. Dinner didn't end in shouting. It ended in silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than words. I stood up, put on my coat, and as I walked out my phone buzzed on the table. A new message lit the screen. It was Jenna, and it simply read, "Call me. Urgent." I didn't answer. Not yet. Because I knew that this was only the first domino, and once I touched the next one, everything would fall exactly the way I planned. Can you guess what happened next? The morning after that dinner, I woke up with a kind of steady anger that did not jump or shout but sat in my chest like a decision. Because once you finally see the shape of a problem, you either keep pretending or you start pulling threads, and I was done pretending. So I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began with the one thing I had avoided for years, which was a full download of my credit history, my open accounts, and any application tied to my name, knowing that once I looked I could not unsee it, and that would force me to act in ways my family would call disloyal, even though it was simply self-respect. The report was not explosive at first glance, which is how these things start, not with a fire but with a quiet list of little cuts that add up, small balances carried forward on a store card I never used, service charges on a business account I had never heard of, a shipping address that was not mine but that I recognized as my parents' house, and the more I scrolled the more obvious it became that this was not a mistake or a one-off lapse, it was a habit. A routine built on my name because my name made the doors open without questions, and when I checked the notifications from the freeze I placed on the ride home, there it was in black and white, a declined purchase attempted late at night, flagged within minutes of my block. And I did not have to wonder who tried it, because I had just watched him wave to the waiter and act generous with a card that never belonged to him. I did not call anyone, I did not send a dramatic text, and I did not beg for understanding, because I have learned that explanations are a currency people spend to delay consequences. Instead, I started a simple spreadsheet with dates, merchants, amounts, and the exact labels the report used, and while I filled those lines I remembered every little moment I had ignored, like envelopes addressed to me that my mother placed on the hall table and later dismissed as junk, or a voicemail about an overdue membership that made no sense at the time, and I felt the shame shift from my shoulders to where it belonged. Before lunch I filed disputes on the accounts that used my identity, and I attached screenshots of the freeze confirmation, the restaurant charge, the odd business account, and the reused address, keeping the tone flat and factual so that no one could dismiss me as emotional or confused, and when the system asked whether I wanted alerts on any new activity tied to my social security number, I selected every available option. Because if he tried even one more door, I wanted it to slam before he could get his foot through it. When I closed the browser, I saw a message from Jenna asking if we could talk for a few minutes without Ethan present, and I said yes. Meet me near the park by the coffee stand where people mind their own business, and she arrived with that same calm face from the dinner, carrying a small folder the way you carry something you wish you never had to collect, and she told me in a steady voice that she had watched him reroute a few payments through an account with my name because he said it avoided fees and that he would fix it later, and then later became the default, and he laughed when she questioned him and said I was fine with it because family understands family. And that one sentence told me everything I needed to know about how he had been selling my silence as consent. Jenna slid her phone across the table and showed me 2 screenshots of transfers, both labeled with the same shell company name that I had seen on my report, along with a short voice memo where Ethan asked her to process something the same way as before, and not to change the memo line, which turned out to be the first 3 words of an old project file of mine, and I felt the anger cool into something sharper, because now it was not only my credit he had borrowed, it was my work, my labor, and the language I had once written late at night when he had asked for help years ago and promised he would learn from it. I thanked her, I promised I would not drag her into any public mess, and I asked for permission to save the files, which she granted with a tired nod that looked like relief, and then I walked home and added her evidence to my timeline. And as I lined up dates with the charges, I saw the pattern click together, because the small purchases corresponded to showy moments, the dinners, the bottle he liked to order when someone else was watching, the sharp shoes he wore to meetings he bragged about, all of it measured and timed so that the bills landed far from the moments that earned him praise. The next move was not cinematic, and it did not need to be. I called the fraud line, confirmed my disputes, documented the LLC using my parents' address, and placed a verbal password on my files so that no one could call in and smooth talk a representative into lifting a hold. And when the agent asked whether I knew the person who might have opened these accounts, I said yes and spelled his name slowly. Not because I wanted him punished by a stranger, but because I finally understood that protecting him had never protected me and had not even protected our parents. It had only kept him comfortable. Right before I closed my laptop, an email landed from a company I did not recognize at first. And then my stomach twisted because it was Ethan's employer sending a blast to their mailing list with a bright headline congratulating his team for a strategic win, and the first paragraph quoted a line that I remembered typing years ago. Right down to a clumsy phrase I had tried to fix, but left in a draft he somehow kept, and I sat there very still while the pieces locked into place, because this was bigger than a card or a pair of shoes. It was a habit of taking whatever made him look good and trusting that the rest of us would keep quiet so the story stayed clean. I did not reply to the email, and I did not forward it to my parents, because I knew exactly what they would say, and I did not need their permission to see what I saw. I opened my old files instead, searched for the proposal I had written under a deadline that year, and placed it side by side with the sentence in the company announcement, and the match was so exact it felt like reading my own voice through someone else's mouth, which is a particular kind of violation that does not leave a bruise, but still hurts when you breathe. I saved both documents to a new folder labeled with a date and a plain title that would mean something to me later. Then I closed the laptop and let the room go quiet. Because when you are dealing with someone who thrives on attention, the most unsettling sound you can give them is nothing at all. And in that quiet, I made a simple promise to myself that I would not raise my voice. I would raise the standard. And I would let proof do the heavy lifting. The next morning, his boss sent a follow-up congratulations with an attachment that included the full language of the so-called winning strategy, and the opening paragraph used a line I wrote years ago, word for word. By the time the second company email landed with the attachment that laid out the so-called winning strategy in full sentences that I knew by cadence and by the little imperfections I had once promised myself to edit someday, I had already decided that I would not argue with anyone who preferred a performance over evidence, and that meant I would speak to the only audience that matters when truth and authorship are in question, which is a compliance channel that timestamps what you say and asks for exhibits instead of feelings. So I opened my old proposal, exported a clean copy with its original creation date intact, circled the phrases that matched the announcement word for word, and wrote a short note without adjectives that said, "Here is my document, here is theirs, here are the dates, and here is my relationship to the person now being celebrated," after which I attached the files and sent them to the company's ethics inbox with a subject line that no one could misread. I did not tell my parents I had done this, because I could already hear the argument forming in my mother's mouth about how family matters should remain inside the house, and how people outside will not understand context, which is a polite way of saying that a false story is easier to maintain when fewer eyes look at it, and I had given them that comfort for too many years already. So I simply waited for a reply while tightening the other loose ends that Ethan had been using as handholds, including reconfirming the credit freeze, placing alerts on any address changes, and writing down a sequence of next steps that would keep me from reacting impulsively when he tried to spin. When the ethics office wrote back, the message was brief and professional, asking whether I would be available for a short call to confirm authorship and to provide any additional context. And although part of me wanted to tell them the whole family history and how favoritism trains you to doubt your own eyes, I kept the call functional, told them where and when the original deck was written, described the version control process at my old job, and explained how Ethan would have had access, because he had asked me for help during a rough month a few years back, and I had sent him drafts, not thinking for a second that a draft would become a permanent shortcut, after which the investigator thanked me, asked permission to share my materials internally, and said they would place the award under review while they sorted out sources and acknowledgments. Within an hour, the public post on the company site was edited to a vaguer message that no longer carried the line that used to belong to me, and the comment section that had been full of congratulations went quiet in the way comment sections get quiet when people sense that something is not quite clean, and though I took no pleasure in the awkward silence, I also felt no guilt, Because the only thing I had done was point at a mirror and ask that someone look, which should not be controversial, unless the reflection is inconvenient. Predictably, my mother called with the voice she uses when she is trying to flatten a situation into something manageable. And she asked me to stop stirring things up because Ethan was under a lot of stress and because this kind of attention could hurt his reputation. And I told her calmly that his reputation was his to manage and that I was only responsible for my name and my work, and that if anyone had wanted to avoid public discomfort, then they should have avoided private theft, which did not land well. So she accused me of trying to ruin his big moment, and I answered that his big moment was built on a foundation that did not belong to him, and that I was done subsidizing his image. Jenna texted that afternoon asking if I was safe to talk, which made me laugh in a tired way because the people who cover for men like Ethan often feel like they are breaking a treaty by telling the truth. And I promised her I would keep her out of any direct confrontation while asking if she would, in the event this escalated, be willing to confirm that Ethan had reused language he knew was not his and had routed payments through accounts carrying my name. And she replied with a short yes, followed by a note that she had 2 internal emails saved where he instructed her not to change phrasing because it was part of the pitch, which I added to my growing folder with careful labels in case anyone questioned provenance. That evening I sent Ethan a calendar invitation titled in the plainest language I could manage, which was "Return what you borrowed," and I set it for 1 week out so that he had time to process the idea that the family schedule would no longer protect him. And in the description, I wrote 1 sentence that laid out the simple terms I intended to discuss, which were that he would unwind any accounts opened in my name, sign a repayment plan for charges that had already landed on my credit, and send a 1-paragraph acknowledgement to his employer that the celebrated strategy drew from materials I authored, after which I clicked send, watched the invitation sit for an hour, and then saw the decline arrive with a flippant note that he was too busy to entertain drama. I forwarded the decline to the ethics inbox with a single line saying that the individual had been given a straightforward opportunity to correct the record and had refused. Then I put my phone down and let the silence do what noise never could. And for the first time in a long while I felt the balance tilt away from the theater of family meals and toward a structure that took my side not because I was loud, but because my documents were in order. The next day brought an unexpected consequence that did not come from me at all, which is the kind of consequence I trust, because Ethan's manager sent a company-wide note saying that recognitions would be paused pending a routine review of source materials. And in the same hour my father left a voicemail with the brittle tone he gets when he wants to sound neutral, asking whether I had spoken to anyone outside the family, and I called him back and told him the truth in 1 long sentence, that yes, I had, that I had kept my statements precise, and that I would be happy to show him every file if he wanted to understand rather than defend, and he thanked me in a way that sounded like relief through a thin wall, which told me he was tired too. I thought that would be the end of that day, a pause after a decisive set of moves. But when I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a spare key, the mail had already been brought in, and my mother was standing at the counter with an envelope in her hand that did not look like a catalog or a birthday card. And even from the doorway I could see the return address and the 3 letters printed at the top line that make anyone with a pulse adjust their posture, and she looked at me and said my name in a way that carried both accusation and fear, and I knew without opening it that the story had just shifted from a family disagreement to something that required a level of honesty we had never practiced. When my mother held that envelope with the government seal across the top, her expression was not confusion so much as a practiced disbelief, the kind of look she had used for years whenever Ethan's actions brushed too close to exposure. And she said my name like she wanted me to deny responsibility before she even opened it, but I stood still in the doorway because I already knew what the letter would contain, not in detail but in tone. A formal request for clarification about the LLC that used their home address and my identity as collateral, and while she tore it open with shaking hands, my father's face turned the color of someone who had just realized the word clerical error would no longer be enough to make the problem disappear. The letter was short but heavy. asking for documentation tied to accounts I had already frozen, listing the name of the shell company that Ethan had invented years back as a joke, and instructing that someone respond within a set number of days. Otherwise, penalties would apply. My mother immediately insisted that it had to be a mistake and that I should call them to fix it before things spiraled, but I looked her in the eye and told her clearly that I had already filed disputes, submitted reports of identity theft, and built a timeline of every account Ethan had opened using my information, and that if the agency asked me for clarification, I would provide it in full, because I was done protecting anyone's comfort at the expense of my own future. The silence that followed was not agreement, but the first crack in a wall that had stood in our family for decades, and my father broke it by admitting that he had noticed strange letters before but chose not to confront Ethan because he thought it would embarrass him. That same day, I received another email from Ethan's company, this one far less celebratory, informing me that the award tied to a supposed achievement had been suspended pending a complete review, and that they required Ethan to provide original source files and drafts, which I knew he could not do because the originals lived in my folder and carried metadata that no clever excuse could erase. They thanked me again for cooperating, promised confidentiality, and noted that plagiarism investigations were taken seriously, which told me the situation was no longer just an uncomfortable family matter, but a professional threat to him. And instead of satisfaction, I felt a kind of sober confirmation that the system, slow though it might be, was beginning to do the work I had initiated quietly. Later that evening, Jenna called me to say she was moving her things out of Ethan's apartment, that she had left her key on the counter with a note that simply said, "Tell the truth or I will," and that she could not keep covering for someone who did not even respect the basic dignity of the people closest to him. I heard the weariness in her voice, but also the relief, as if finally stepping out of his shadow had given her permission to breathe again, and I told her that she did not owe me or anyone else her continued silence, and that if she wanted to step back entirely, I would not hold it against her, but she insisted she was willing to confirm details if necessary, because she was tired of watching him get away with everything. My mother reacted to all of this by repeating her old refrain that family problems stay in the family, but I told her calmly that I agreed in principle, which is why I had scheduled a living room meeting for Saturday with 3 clear rules: no shouting, no recording on phones, and every resolution written down and signed before anyone left. She bristled at the formality, but I explained that this was the only way to prevent another cycle of denial, because written words carry a weight that excuses do not, and I could see that my father, weary of years of cover-ups, quietly approved of the structure. In the meantime, I decided to raise the stakes in a way that would make Ethan understand the seriousness of what he had done without dragging the matter into public view just yet. I drafted a simple settlement agreement that required him to repay the balances incurred under my name, to cover the costs of cleaning up my credit, and to issue a written acknowledgement that the work presented to his employer had originated with me. It was not about punishing him, it was about setting the record straight and restoring what had been taken. I emailed the draft to him with the subject line, "Return what you borrowed," attaching nothing emotional, only the document itself. His reply came quickly, dripping with arrogance, dismissing the entire thing as overblown and unnecessary, claiming that everyone borrows a little from family and that I was making a spectacle out of nothing. He refused to sign, laughed at the idea of repayment, and warned me not to push too far because you don't want to burn bridges you'll need someday. I read his words twice, closed the message, and then forwarded the entire exchange to the government case officer handling the identity theft report, attaching the settlement draft as evidence that he had been given a private opportunity to resolve matters and had refused. I also included the HR ticket number from his employer, tying the financial misconduct to the professional misconduct in one neat thread. That night, while I sat at my desk, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan himself, a short line sent after midnight, "You would not dare." I stared at the words and realized he still thought this was a game of bluffing, that he could intimidate me into retreating like every other time before, and I almost laughed at the irony because by the time he sent that message the files were already uploaded. The disputes were already logged, and the meeting was already scheduled. There was nothing left to dare, because I had already acted. I went to bed knowing that the walls he had leaned on for so long were crumbling, not because I shouted louder than him, but because I had finally understood that quiet paired with evidence is louder than any performance, and I knew that when Saturday came, I would place everything on the table and make him choose between signing or facing the very consequences he had mocked, and either way, the story of Ethan being untouchable would end in that living room. By the time Saturday arrived, the tension in the house felt like it had been accumulating for years rather than days, because every unresolved slight, every ignored warning, and every carefully hidden document had finally collected into one pile of proof that could no longer be dismissed as exaggeration or sibling rivalry. I came prepared with a folder that was thin in appearance, but heavy in consequence, containing the timeline of accounts opened in my name, the correspondence from the government agency, the email chain with his employer's ethics office, the declined settlement draft, and even the screenshots Jenna had given me. My parents were already seated in the living room, looking strained and cautious, while Ethan sat with his arms folded across his chest, trying to appear unfazed, but betraying himself with the way his foot tapped against the floor. I placed the folder on the coffee table and announced calmly that this conversation would be simple, that there were two paths forward, and that he would decide which one the family remembered. I began by telling a story from years earlier, one that seemed trivial at the time but carried the blueprint for everything that had followed. In middle school, Ethan had once copied the title and outline of my science project, presenting it as his own, and when I complained, my mother told me to let it go because it was just a project and not worth making a fuss about. Everyone laughed back then, but that moment taught Ethan that borrowing from me was safe, because I would be silenced in the name of keeping peace, and he had simply scaled that lesson up with age, moving from science projects to credit cards, from outlines to proposals, until he built a reputation entirely on pieces that did not belong to him. I told them I had forgiven myself for being quiet then, but I would not forgive myself if I stayed quiet now. I laid out the terms of the settlement once more, clearly and without embellishment. He would sign a repayment agreement covering every charge in my name. He would take responsibility for the credit repair fees. And he would send a written acknowledgement to his employer retracting any claim to authorship of the strategy that carried my language. If he signed, the matter would remain contained within these walls and the agencies already informed. If he refused, I would provide my full documentation to the case officer and allow the process to continue without my restraint. I explained that I would not accept any bailout from my parents on his behalf, because if they paid his debt for him, then I would cut ties entirely. My father asked, with his voice steadier than I expected, how much money was at stake, and I gave him the amount and the dates, written plainly on the document in front of him, stressing that while the total was not ruinous, the pattern it represented was far more damaging. My mother began to protest that siblings should forgive one another, but I interrupted gently and reminded her that forgiveness is a choice that requires acknowledgement, and that without accountability, forgiveness becomes nothing more than an invitation for repeated harm. Ethan leaned back, smirked in the way he always had when he thought charm could defuse reality, and launched into a speech about family loyalty, hard times, and how everyone borrows now and then, but I reached into my pocket, pressed play on my phone, and let his own recorded voicemail fill the room, the one where he had said clearly, "It is temporary. She will never notice." The words hung there longer than his smile could survive, and for the first time I watched my parents hear him without the filter of excuses or denial. The room fell into a silence heavier than shouting, and I used that silence to slide the pen across the table toward him, repeating once more, "Here is how you return what you borrowed." He stared at the paper, then at me, and for a moment I saw panic break through the mask of control, because he understood that this was not a bluff, not a family squabble, but the point at which his image could fracture beyond repair. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he signed the agreement. I instructed him to open his laptop, log into his bank, and schedule the first transfer while everyone was present, and though he muttered under his breath, he followed through, hitting confirm in front of witnesses who could no longer pretend not to see. When the transfer receipt hit my inbox, I immediately attached it to the settlement file and sent it to myself with a timestamp, then forwarded the signed acknowledgement to the ethics officer at his company. My father exhaled audibly, as though years of unspoken tension had finally been given form, while my mother sat rigid, unable to process that silence had lost its power. Ethan pushed the papers away like they were toxic, but the damage was already done, because for the first time the myth of his untouchability had collapsed right there in the living room. I stood, thanked them all for keeping the meeting calm, and stated clearly that this was not about revenge, but about boundaries. If a single payment was missed, or if he attempted to interfere with my credit again, I would forward the full folder to the government agency without hesitation. I told my parents that I loved them, but that enabling was no longer love, it was complicity, and I would not participate in it anymore. Then I picked up the thin folder, tucked it under my arm, and walked toward the door with a steadiness that years ago I could not have imagined carrying. On the way out, my mother called after me, asking if I could not show just a little mercy, but I turned back and told her that mercy without change is only an invitation for more harm, and that I had chosen to value my own worth enough to stop being a silent resource for someone else's illusion. My father did not argue. He simply nodded, perhaps realizing that protecting Ethan had never truly protected the family. That night, lying in bed, I felt the exhaustion settle in, but beneath it was a quiet strength I had not felt before, a certainty that I had not only defended my future, but also rewritten the family script that had silenced me for so long. The message I kept repeating in my mind was simple. Do you know your true worth? It is whatever you decide to protect. For the first time in my life, I had protected mine, and no amount of charm, denial, or pleading would ever undo that decision.